All right, guys, it's day 3. Welcome back to Mealtime News. All right, so we're going to get into a lot of good stuff today. Get yourself a meal, get yourself a snack, put me on the headphones, put me on the JBL, whatever you got to do. Let's dive into it. We're going to start with a tweet of the day. This is a tweet that either makes me laugh or I think is important in terms of politics. This one is the former, definitely not the latter. I'll put it up on the screen. So at ACYN basically clipped this clip from Jesse Waters talking on Fox News. He's one of the hosts over there. And he was talking about the Trump mugshot. And he said, quote, "I say this with an unblemished record of heterosexuality. He looks good and he looks hard." And then Jay at Kendall Hosseini then quote tweeted it saying this is like Tom Wambsgans if he anchored for ATN, which I think is a fabulous comparison. But nonetheless, not a super politically important one, but I think very funny. So let's get into some of the real meat and potatoes of today, the real actual news of the day. So there's a couple stories I want to talk about. The first is this one with respect to the Spain Soccer Federation. So the Spain Soccer Federation has this chief named Luis Rubiales. I guess that's his job title, the Soccer Federation chief. And he just got suspended by FIFA, the organization, I guess, that oversees the Soccer Federation. And they released a statement saying he would be suspended from all football-related activities at national and international levels for an initial period of 90 days. And this all follows from this odd moment that occurred after the Spanish women's national team won their last game and were being awarded their medals. They were being celebrated and congratulated by everybody, and all the people affiliated with the team were hugging them and giving them kisses on the cheek. And then this woman, Jennifer Hermoso, who plays on the team, got kind of down the congratulations line to this Luis Rubiales, I guess, and he gave her at first like a kiss on the cheek, which was pretty normal, and then like grabbed her head, pulled her in, and just gave her a big old smooch on the lips. And it was pretty weird. I mean, I'll put the video up right now so you can see, but watching it was pretty odd. And I don't think you can really excuse this as one of those European things where it's just culturally different over there and they kiss each other on the cheek and they're more touchy-feely, whatever. No, this did seem weird. And Hermoso came out and said, "I felt vulnerable and the victim of an impulse-driven, sexist, out-of-place act without any consent on my part." And I totally get that. I think that makes a ton of sense and that she's super reasonable to feel that way. But Rubiales defended himself, despite the fact that that seems pretty reasonable. He said, and he described this in this super weird way. And I don't know if it was a translation issue from Spanish to English or if maybe he had someone else translate his words, but it comes off sounding like it was this thing written for like 50 Shades of Grey or like erotica in the way that he's responding to it, which I think is a pretty bad PR move. He says that the kiss had been, quote, "spontaneous, mutual, euphoric, and consensual." And I'll put the video up again just to really juxtapose his description versus kind of what actually happened. I mean, he pulled her head in. He then went on to say that she was the one who lifted me in her arms and brought me close to her body. I don't think he should have defended himself. I think this could have gone away, and he should have at least apologized, and it probably would have gone away, and there wouldn't have been, I think, who knows if he would have had to resign or what would have happened, but at the very least, he should have apologized. But to not only defend yourself in this instance, but also defend yourself with these quotes, I think is a pretty poor PR move. But it makes me think of like, because I was an athlete, I mean, not a great one, but I played basketball in high school, and I had a coach who was also bald. I guess this guy was a federation chief, but I had a coach. And a bald coach. And if he, after one of the games that we had won when we were celebrating, like grabbed my head and just kissed me on the lips, yeah, I would be pretty upset about that. And if I saw him do that to one of my teammates, it would make me pretty uncomfortable thinking, could this happen to me? I'm sure the parents would probably hate it. But yeah, all this is to say, it seems like Hermoso is pretty obviously in the right on this one and that he should have apologized. And it may end up hurting him more that he didn't apologize, is they are now keeping this in the news, and he may end up getting fired or worse, having legal action taken against him. So let's talk about Vivek. This was the second story I wanted to talk about because Vivek is steadily rising in the polls, and he was in Iowa this past Friday. And I think you can credit his rise in the polls to Vivek's willingness to just say and do things that other Republican candidates are unwilling to say or do. And I think it helps him and it hurts him. So what is he willing to do and say that other Republicans aren't? So one example might be how when he was getting on stage, he came out rapping the Eminem song. No other Republican is gonna do that. He also, I mean, he says stuff that is so firebrandy and intentionally controversial that it does get him in the news. He compared Democratic Representative Ayanna Pressley, who's kind of in this coalition of representatives in the House of Representatives, with AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, this very progressive segment of the Democratic caucus. And he compared her and Ibram X. Kendi, who's this author who wrote a ton and published a lot of scholarship in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the following protests. He said of both of them that they are, quote, the modern grand wizards of the modern KKK. And quotes like these make it hard to see him doing well outside of that group of people that agree with a quote like that. I mean, for somebody who doesn't agree with that quote, you probably find that quote pretty objectionable, and I think fairly so. The second point I'd make on this, in line with that, is just I don't love these comparisons of people to these historically awful and heinous either groups or individuals. Like when people compare either people to the KKK, which was so awful, or to the Holocaust or Hitler, which was also kind of uniquely awful, I think it cheapens the horror of those groups and how bad those groups really were and the moral egregiousness of them, and it makes it more commonplace. And I think a lot of people hold that opinion, though it may not be super important to them. I do think people don't love hearing somebody compare somebody who's clearly not anywhere near, you could say morally awful at all, but anywhere near morally awful is the KKK. I think that's just really off-putting to a lot of people. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, it's unclear if Vivek is even running to be president. He may at this point just be running to be a part of the Trump administration, either as VP or as a member of Trump's cabinet. So let's talk about some of Vivek's positions that he holds, his policy positions, and investigate if there's any merit there or if some of them are just kind of ridiculous. So the first one I wanted to talk about is his position that we should raise the minimum age of voting to 25 unless people between the ages of 18 and 25 can pass this civics test that you have to pass if you want to become a citizen of the United States. So I have a couple problems with this. First, I think it's really hard to make that argument when a good chunk of the military is not yet 25, and probably a portion of those people who aren't yet 25 in the military would not be able to pass that test. At least without studying for a really long time. And I think it's really hard to make the case that people should volunteer to fight for the country while at the same time they're unable to vote. I think that's a hard pitch to sell. I also think that is probably uniquely hard to sell to other Republicans because Republicans are overrepresented in the military. The second point there is I think were it to pass, which seems incredibly unlikely, I think it would almost certainly get struck down by the Supreme Court, is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, is kind of a way to ensure equal protection under the law. But there's this very specific clause in the 14th Amendment which details that every citizen of the United States is entitled to equal protection under the law. And historically, as we found out in the 60s, when there were these laws that ended up having such a disproportionate impact on groups that they made it so those groups couldn't vote in some stuff like literacy tests and other Jim Crow laws. Those laws were found to be unconstitutional on the grounds of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And I think in the same way, if this law were to have any disproportionate impact, then it would very likely be found to be unconstitutional under that exact same clause. All right, the third response I'd have to this is that young people already don't vote in huge numbers. I mean, young people are the lowest voting demographic of any of the age demographics. And if they had to complete a civics test, I think this would more or less eliminate the young person's vote. I think the vast majority of young people would just wait until they're 25 in order to vote. And I think this is a bad thing. I think you could make the case that this is a good thing because it's good to have more maturity. But I do think that young people have unique interests that ought to be represented in government. And those interests cut both in favor of the Republicans and in favor of the Democrats. So one example of how it could cut in favor of Republicans is that young people probably don't want us as much to blow out the budget because we're going to be the ones paying it back in the future. We're going to be the ones that have to deal with fiscal irresponsibility when we end up having to pay the bills and when the interest rate payments on our debt get incredibly high or even surpass our own GDP. And the second point is climate change. I mean, an example in favor of the Democrats, on the other hand, is that young people really care about climate change because they're not going to die as soon, and they have a unique interest in stuff like that. And so they may, or they should rather, have those interests represented in government because no other group will hold those interests in the same way that young people will. So what are some other Vivek positions that are, borderline questionable or outright questionable? So I think this is a more debatable one, but he thinks that support for Ukraine pushes Russia rather further into the hands of China. And this Chinese-Russian alliance, the Sino-Russian alliance, is a much bigger threat than we face by each one individually. I do think, however, there's a ton of weight that has to be given to the point that Nikki Haley made in the Republican primary debate, where she said that it's not as though those two countries aren't already working together with one another. I mean, they're already in bed together. They're with this BRICS conference where they're developing this alternative currency that will challenge the US dollar's dominance on the global stage as the vehicle for financial transactions between countries. I mean, BRICS being an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China. These nations are already kind of working together, and it's not as though fighting back against Russia in the arena of Ukraine is really going to drastically change the extent to which they're cooperative. So I don't know that in that sense it really hurts, but it does help to help Ukraine in that it stops Russia from moving further into Europe and potentially encroaching into a country that is owned by NATO, or not owned by NATO, but is a member of NATO. Because then the U.S. is contractually obligated. They're bound by the contract they have with NATO, by their treaty, I should say. They're bound by their treaty to get involved if Russia were to invade a NATO country. And so it's almost a buffer zone that we're keeping going, with Ukraine being the buffer between Russia and the other NATO countries in Europe that Putin could potentially want to incorporate into Russia. Final point I want to talk about that Vivek makes in terms of policy is that he wants to eliminate like half of the federal government, which is something that I think is pretty ridiculous. He said he wants to eliminate the Department of Education, which you could make the case for. That's not, I think, the worst elimination. The FBI, which is, I think, insane. The ATF, also, I think, a bad idea. The nuclear, sound like George Bush. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, fine. The IRS, really bad call. And the Department of Commerce, fine. So let's go through the ones that I think are the worst ones to eliminate and that don't really make a lot of sense to eliminate. So first is the FBI. You need somebody to prosecute federal crime, right? The way it works is there are crimes, some of which rise to the level of federal crimes or are definitionally federal crimes because they happen in multiple states. Some of them are just state crimes. The vast majority of crimes are tried as state crimes. But there are federal crimes that can really only make sense to be charged as federal crimes. And it's important that we have something there to charge those federal crimes. So then you would ask, okay, he obviously probably has some plan to still deal with that problem. Like, he's not just going to let federal crime happen with no punishment. So he's just going to replace the FBI with something new. And then you would say, well, at that point, you shouldn't replace the FBI. You should just fix the parts you don't like about it. Like replace the personnel or change the regulatory framework under which the FBI operates. But to say that you want to abolish the FBI and create this whole new agency seems just like another one of these firebrandy, intentionally controversial statements that he makes in order to get his name out in the news more. The ATF is another good example. Like, if you don't like, and I totally get a lot of Second Amendment advocates' claims that the ATF is really bad and goes after the wrong people. If you don't like what the ATF does, you don't have to get rid of the ATF. But at the same time, there's certainly things that the ATF does do that you probably are a fan of. Like the ATF will get people that have tanks in trouble, for example. I mean, I don't even know if that, I'm trying to think. I haven't even heard of news stories of people with these crazy, but like somebody that has or fashions this ridiculous gun that could do a lot of damage that nobody wants on the streets. Like, I don't know, a grenade launcher. Like the ATF should be there to deal with stuff like that. And if you don't like the ATF going after bump stocks or any of the like rules that they've made, the short barrel rifle restrictions that they've created, then you can just change those rules without abolishing the ATF. But once again, he chooses the most controversial option and does so in order to create more of a name for himself. He also said he would get rid of the IRS. This goes without saying. The government needs to collect taxes. The government, in order to function, needs to collect taxes. It's the same argument with all the others. If you don't like something about the IRS, you are the boss of the IRS. You can change it. I mean, you can say that in the past people have done an insufficiently good job at changing it, but when you're the president, it's going to be a lot easier to change the IRS than it would be to demolish the IRS and just create a new IRS under a new name without the parts that you don't like. So again, Vivek just trying to put his name out there helps him in the short term, but I don't think really helps him in terms of getting his name into a good spot for the general election. Finally, let's talk about China's economy. So they're really in a lot of trouble here with the housing crisis. China faces this big housing bubble where for the last basically 3 decades, it was giving all of these property developers, it was helping subsidize these really cheap loans where they could get, say, $1,000 of loans, and only have to pay $1,010 back, as an example, like a really low interest rate loan. And what that did is it encouraged a ton of investment, and real estate became a huge component of Chinese GDP. And so when all of these property developers were making all this money by building all these new properties to accommodate all of these people in China that were flooding in from the rural areas to the cities in search for work, they were doing really well. They were very profitable. It was a huge engine for Chinese growth over the last 3 decades. But all that has to come to an end. I mean, the Chinese government back in 2020 started rightfully feeling very concerned that there was this bubble, that there was an investment in the housing sector, that they were building too many apartments and things that people couldn't afford. I mean, people were spending so much more as a share of their yearly income, so much more on an apartment in China than people were spending on a house in the United States. I mean, it was really such a culturally prized thing to be an owner of an apartment. And so a lot of people had wealth tied up there. It became this huge component of Chinese GDP. But now, because there's not as much free-flowing money, because the loans are more expensive, now instead of taking out $1,000 and paying back $1,010, you have to take out $1,000, maybe you pay back $1,100, going from like a 1% to a 10% interest rate. So because it's more expensive to borrow money, you have to pay $99 more in that simplistic example I just gave. These companies have less cash on hand. And so they can't pay back their bills. They can't use some of the loan money either to finish their projects to generate more revenue or to pay back the bills that they have to pay on the loans that they've already taken out. And so a lot of these big real estate developers are defaulting. And because Chinese individuals have so much of their money tied up in these apartments, some of which haven't even been built yet, just the promise of an apartment, that a lot of these people are being very cautious with their spending. Those people that invested in the apartments, not the big property developers, but the individuals that bought an apartment in the hopes that it would be a path towards wealth, now that they're seeing this unfold where the housing market rather is starting to not do as well and their investment may not be as profitable, they're going to spend less of their disposable income, and that hurts other sectors of the Chinese economy as well. So China's economy is really on the brink, and we're going to keep our eye on it, but it could be imminent collapse. All right, finally, to move on to everyone's favorite section besides Tweet of the Day, which is the flop-ed section, where I take an op-ed from each side of the political aisle, one from the left, one from the right, and kind of give the devil's advocate position against them. So again, these aren't necessarily positions that I hold. I'm going to talk as though I am holding those positions, but it's really just me spitballing arguments and trying to get us to understand more how people that don't think the way we do are thinking. So let's start with this op-ed from Jamel Bowie in the New York Times. This is a shorter op-ed, and it was titled "The Republican Debate prove that Trump has what it takes. He writes, like far too many of you, I watched the Republican presidential debate on Wednesday night, during which all of the most popular contenders in the field tried to stand out and establish themselves as a serious alternative for the Republican presidential nomination. So I want to start off with just something that I think conservatives really hate about Democrats, especially about these media outlets, is this air of smugness that seems to overwhelm all of their maybe well-founded criticisms of Republicans. But this moral high ground, I'm better than you, it's a given that we're in the right position and you're in the wrong position. It's so distasteful to so many people. And I think the first line of this op-ed really encapsulates that air of moral high ground, as I call it, where he says, like far too many of you, I watched the Republican presidential debate on Wednesday night. Very frustrating. I think Republicans are pissed off about that. And I do think it is kind of like that South Park episode where the people in San Francisco were just sniffing their own farts because they thought they were so cool and thought they were so important and morally virtuous.
Here in San Francisco.
Let's keep going. So he said, the issue wasn't just that Trump was unavoidable. It was that none of the other candidates had much to say for themselves. He missed what was really the point of the debate, which is to distinguish between the not Trump candidates. Like, I don't think that they were trying to distinguish themselves more than just who's the number 2 spot. It's obvious that Trump is by far and away the likely candidate. He's the frontrunner. He's by far and away the likely candidate to get the GOP nomination. But the only path forward for a lot of these candidates is to distinguish among each other, not among them and Trump, because they're obviously not Trump. And none of them will be Trump. Maybe Vivek will try to, but none of them will be Trump. It's to say who among us should be number 2. And I do think that a lot of them did a reasonably good job in distinguishing between themselves on the question of abortion, like that Nikki Haley and Mike Pence exchange, on the question of Ukraine, like Vivek versus Nikki Haley and Chris Christie, like on January 6th, like Pence versus Vivek. I think there are a lot of issues on which they can distinguish themselves, and I think they did do a relatively good job of doing that. Okay, he goes on to write, as I argued in our post-debate recap, none of the candidates had any of the charisma or presence or vision that might mark them as something more than just another governor or legislator. And I think this is kind of the funniest line here, saying that none of the candidates had any of the charisma, presence, or vision. From the Democratic point of view, I'm interested to know, Jamel Bowie, who you think that's in leadership right now does have that charisma, presence, and vision. Is it Joe Biden, the man that regularly stumbles over his own words? Is it Kamala Harris, the least popular vice president in the last 50 years? Who knows? But again, just playing devil's advocate, none of these are necessarily my positions. Okay, let's move on to the next op-ed. This is Ken Blackwell, writing for Breitbart, saying, disarming Americans, this is the title, mind you, saying disarming Americans is the best way to enslave them. So he's saying that as we disarm Americans, we approach closer to these countries like Venezuela and Weimar Germany and, other periods of time where totalitarian leaders, have really restricted the freedom of the people over whom they rule. Okay, what does he write? He says, authoritarians confiscate guns. Why? Because gun rights are the linchpin protecting citizens from loss of all rights. So I think this gets right to the heart of an issue that I think is important and that I'm not totally sure I have my mind made up about, which is, but certainly I have my mind made up about the direction. And I think this is pretty inarguable, that today the Second Amendment is less important in protecting our rights than it was 200 years ago when there was more parity between a government army and a militia, right? So at a time where the government army was muskets and cannons and a militia army was muskets and no cannons, those were pretty equal, right? And over 200 years is the government has moved forward and the militia army has, improved, but not in the same way that a government army has. It's much more lopsided now. So just from a factual perspective, it seems hard to believe that if it were government versus the people, which obviously that's not how it would shake out if this were to be something that would happen, I don't think the people would win. I mean, the government barely even fights with ground troops anymore abroad. They use their Air Force, their Navy, drones, stuff like that. So it's not clear that having AR-15s, I don't know that protecting ourselves against the government is the best argument in favor of those rights. But that's what he's arguing here. Let's continue onward. So he says, modern history provides troubling proof that the loss of liberty is preceded by the disarmament of citizens. So I take issue with this argument, one, because there's examples where that's not true. Australia did a huge gun buyback program like 10-ish years ago. I mean, you could argue, and I'm sure conservatives would, that under COVID, Australians lost a lot of freedoms, but so too did people lose a lot of freedoms under COVID in the United States, where there were a ton of guns and very few restrictions. I mean, you can give a laundry list of countries where there isn't the same accessibility of guns and people do have a ton of freedom. Again, I do buy the argument that at the founding of our country, it was an important way to check back against government overreach. But now I think that we've reached a point where the true checks on government overreach are other parts of our government and are less so the threat that the kind of deterrent threat that the public might fight back if the government goes too far. And I think those other checks against government overreach are just the checks and balances of our country. Like, I think the three separate branches of government. I think the fact that we have a federalist setup where the states have the majority of power and the federal government has less power, I think those two factors play much more of a role in discouraging totalitarian leadership than does people owning guns that likely wouldn't be that significant in an actual conflict that may emerge. All right, that's it. It's already been long enough. I'm going to let you guys go. This has been Mealtime News, Day 3, Episode 3. We're getting after it. We're going to do an Episode 4 tomorrow. I'll see you guys then. Take care.